making room. We all have different beliefs. We have shared values in this space, I hope, or we're growing into shared values. But we're making room for actual pluralism, expressions of authentic faith. We just heard from Christina. And as we grow into this house of prayer for all people, we are going to mean it in a way that not all of us have the same beliefs, but we're all authentically coming to our spaces of openness, mindfulness, and reverence together in this human experience. Inspired by Reverend Peggy Clark, our senior minister, and our director of religious education, who's with our kids right now, Jill, and their movement Disrupt Church, I'm about to start my first in a preaching series of Disrupt Fascism. And we are going to be looking at our values of justice, equity, transformation, pluralism, interdependence, and generosity in pairs. And today we're going to start with pluralism and equity. What do those shared values mean in our Unitarian Universalist context? And we are certainly going to be talking about authoritarianism today. We're going to talk about what Paul was getting at in Athens that we heard from Brother Zachary. We're going to talk about the idols our nation worships. And the idol in the Roman story is Caesar, who's ultimately the problem for the Jewish people and then the Christian people. And amidst the intentional projectile overwhelm being generated by the White House, and remember, overwhelm is the point. So when you feel overwhelmed, slow down, because that's what fascism wants. We're going to ground ourselves in what we know to be plainly true, and we'll look at some patterns that help us know right from wrong. And we'll clear some room for our humanity to live more fully into our big Mother Earth. We are leaning heavily now in this sermon in our Jewish and Christian heritage to know it's true. And like all month, we're leaning into our Buddhist or mindfulness practices around prayer and meditation, as we already have, to ground ourselves to what is. I grew up in Central Jersey in the 70s and 80s. The family stories get told a little differently every time. Do your family stories change over the years? Oh my God. What I heard as a kid is not reality. And sometimes my parents swear they never said what I remember very clearly. But each of my grandparents were either the only sibling who was born in the States, or they were an immigrant themselves. Now, some of that held up to DNA testing, thankfully, and some did not. Germany, the former Czechoslovakia, Sicily, and yes, it's not just Italy, it's Sicilian, thank you. And my other grandfather I never knew, but my one grandmother remarried a Spanish-speaking man from Ecuador, who sadly died before I was born. My mom grew up speaking a smattering of Italian. Her grandmother, my great-grandmother, only spoke Italian. So to communicate, my mom spoke it. And Spanish and English. That's mostly gone now for my mom. Many Italian immigrants back then felt pressured to lose their cultural identity, to survive or thrive in the States. On my dad's side, I come from Pennsylvania coal miner stock. German and Czechoslovakian, Lutheran on my dad's side, Catholic on my dad's mom's side. For folks that remember that period, my dad's mom was forced to convert from Catholicism to Lutheranism so they could get married. And ironically, later, my dad had to swear off raising me Lutheran for my mom to marry him as a Catholic. What did they get from all that? A Unitarian Universalist, thank you. Before I was 5, we were renting an apartment in a multifamily tenement on the outskirts of Perth Amboy, a mostly Latino city in Jersey. Our downstairs neighbors were Egyptian, When I was turning 5, my parents bought a house in another part of Jersey, Woodbridge Township. So the neighborhood we lived in was a working class black neighborhood made up of mostly multi-generational households. And across the street from our new home was the lone Jewish family in our neighborhood, and I was the only white kid in the neighborhood. The Jewish family never had kids. Like everyone else around, I grew up with my grandmother and my uncle living in our multi-generational home. The schools drew from a wider area, so I was lucky to grow up knowing kids from every background. I remember one of my mom's closer friends during my childhood. She was an African woman who was seeking citizenship in the States while her children were raised back home with her husband staying behind and her mother staying behind. It would take her 20 years to legally bring her family over to the States. 20 years to do it legally. That was my America that I grew up in. German, Slovak, Italian, Egyptian, Latino, Black, immigrant, African, Jewish, Catholic. And that was just my experience by maybe the age of 8. Living in the burbs. In grade school, we learned about the Statue of Liberty. It was almost a religious sense of patriotism. And I'm always worried when religion and patriotism get together about what was right and true in that world. What was our story and our birthright? The lady in our New York harbor said, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to be free. The wretched refuse of your teeming shore, send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed, to me. Lift my lamp beside the golden door." It is written on one of the symbols of the best of our nation. That is one America. I want to make room still for that America. There's another America. We're about to be on an anniversary. But on January 27th, that's tomorrow, it'll be the 83rd anniversary of the Holocaust Remembrance Day. 8 years ago, on the 75th anniversary of the Holocaust Remembrance Day, while failing to mention Jewish people in his statement of remembrance, our then former sitting president signed an executive order banning all Syrian refugees. Remember that? And citizens from several Muslim states, our own people. On Holocaust Remembrance Day 8 years ago, during his last tenure, President Trump banned refugees who were fleeing a genocidal government from seeking sanctuary on our shores. And this past week, he began his ICE raids against black and brown skinned people, just trying to follow the dream of our city's own Lady Liberty. I know we had an ICE raid just yesterday in Newark, very close. I'm hearing from friends I lived in Brooklyn for a long time, and I'm hearing from local friends talking about how folks are so scared deliveries from restaurants are not being made because there's no one to pick up the deliveries. And we're already hearing of stories on the West Coast. The fear of the ICE raids are leaving fruit in the fields to rot. And I'm hearing from trans and non-binary friends and colleagues that government IDs that have an X marker, which is an indication of some transition from gender assigned at birth to one's actual gender, are being stopped from updating passports already and other government ID. And it's clear that the current administration has confused affirmative action with DEI, which is a whole range of making sure everyone in the space, from veterans to maternity leave to flexible hours, and is actively purging citizens from nonpartisan government jobs for not having voted for the regime. This is another America. We got this one too. Our reality with a deadly and dangerous kind of making room agenda. What are they making room for? Making room for sameness, for whiteness, for retaining and hoarding power, for reinforcing patriarchy. This sickens me. I literally have moments where I have to stop reading or do what I'm doing because I'm so nauseous I may want to throw up. And I do not mean that with hyperbole. And I know I've heard this from some of you. It's the same. This is so far past the partisan divide. For those that are for this horror, we're ignoring, or they're ignoring, America's heritage and story and the ideal of the American dream, right? The American dream has not been ever for everyone. But when we talk about what we mean by it, we're not aspiring to it right now in our story. We need to be better than this. And even feeling sick about all this, which reminds us that we are human, is also part of the point of the overwhelm. Keep us sick, keep us not thinking straight, keep us confused, keep us exhausted, so we stay home in doing what we're told to do. And this doesn't stop neatly with who gets kicked from our shores. That's a fear that sets in when we begin down this road. One friend of mine, Farah, said that the trickle-down effect for her and her family is that she and those who look like her will have to start carrying their papers everywhere. It means that she will be hassled at every border. It means that her family will be hassled when they come to visit her. It means that any of us could be detained, harassed, and deprived of her rights as American citizens. She's an American citizen, despite her having the name of Farah. We know this to be true because we see this in our border states where Latinos, U.S. citizens, live in fear of harassment and need to carry proof of citizenship at all times. And 8 years ago, we aggressively began that by blocking our Muslim neighbors, and this week we're terrorizing families that include trans members, trans parents, and trans teens. And when I say border states, often I think we internalize that to mean southern states. And I remind you that most of our nation lives in a border territory, a border area that have special rules and laws. 100 miles from the coast. We all live in a border state. Jewish and Christian scripture is very clear on how we're to treat our refugees, the stranger and our neighbor. When Jesus is asked, "Who is my neighbor?" he tells the story of the Good Samaritan in reply. He tells the story of a foreigner of another religion as his answer to who is my neighbor. A foreigner of another religion is our neighbor. We teach our children these values, and Judaism reminds us that we were all slaves in Egypt and foreigners in a foreign land. So treat each other remembering we were once there too. That's in our religious DNA, in our heritage. Any ban along demographic lines wouldn't stand up, frankly, to a kindergartner's test for simple fairness or any biblical test of righteousness. But we know this story from our past too. We're past hyperbole now, or partisanship here. Gone. This isn't an election cycle or a political issue. Faithful people from all political walks of life should oppose these actions. This is basic human decency. This is about our religious conviction, that freedom of religion, that religious pluralism is a spiritual value and a human need. As a child, my generation often wondered, and maybe yours did too, how everyday citizens in Germany could let the horrors perpetrated against the Jews happen, against the Romani, against gays and dissidents. How could that occur? How could they let that happen? How could any people allow the systematic dehumanization to occur to the point where lives were treated as chattel? We now understand that it happened piece by piece and bit by bit. What was once outrageous became acceptable. So you're going to hear from the pulpit a lot of reminders about what's normal and what's outrageous. This is outrageous. Pushing further and further back the line of what was considered normal. Denying the refugees the safety of our shores is not normal. Breaking families apart and ending the 150-year tradition of birthright citizenship so that some are kept out simply because of their race or ethnicity does not fit the American dream, the ideal we talk about. And it's in direct opposition to our religious faith. This needs to be the next line right now we draw as a nation and as a religious community. Pluralism and equity are intrinsic American aspirational values, and they're intrinsic to our Unitarian Universalist identity. If these edicts don't allow for the flourishing of pluralism and equity, they are morally and ethically wrong. They're idols to white religious nationalism that here in the States is taking a Christian flair, wrapped up in false Christian messages. Religious institutions at our best, are bedrocks for prophetic witness, and as an institution, we need all hands on deck for what's happening in our name. So today we heard personal stories of Christian faith that remind us that faith is often individual. We come and express it in community. And that gets taken away when it gets merged with power that's about sameness and hoarding more power. I think some of this is going to come up in another sermon now. I'm going to skip to our end here. Maybe you felt like you were in a sort of fog or haze over the last few weeks. So much of what we don't agree with is happening so fast. Others are feeling the barrage very viscerally. Some of us are less safe. I just woke up 2 days ago being informed there's a Supreme Court case that will invalidate my marriage with my husband. Is that normal? What God has put merged together, that's normal. I don't need a government to tell me that my marriage is not real. I have other words for that will not come up in the pulpit. Our mission here at Community Church is to be a house of prayer for all people. And we don't mean all people are welcome to pray our way. We're going to hear people pray in ways that may not be good, may not be for you. And we're pluralistic. We have folks coming from a whole range of places. Some of them grew up here too, in this church. We mean that all people can pray or not pray here in their way together. Pluralism plus equity are bedrocks for our faith. And it reminds us that we're never alone. Community church, that we hear from one another. Institutions are a bedrock in times of turmoil and will continue to be a place of support, a place of organizing against that which defies our highest values, a place of reminding you in the middle of the week or the start of the week, however you look at Sunday, that there are values that are real, that we share, and we need to return to. And when someone is so far off, they're wrong. And we can say they're wrong. The audacity of saying that an Episcopal bishop who's preaching an Episcopal message in her own Episcopal church somehow doesn't have the right to say that in her own church is weird to me. It's not normal to think that's normal. We'll continue to be a place of support, organizing against which that defies our highest value, and a place of challenge when we fall into complacency. As we begin a new year, I encourage you to support institutions that you have faith in, trust in with your talents and your treasures and your hearts and your minds, so that in the coming year and years, we can continue to be a beacon in the world that needs more places of compassion and spirit, places that live to remind us all we're not alone. Amen, and blessed be.